All right, in this next subunit, I want to focus on postmodernism's connections to Marxism. Postmodernism is, among all of the movements that we were looking at this semester, the most politicized of the movements, and it puts politics right front and center in a way that other philosophical systems of education do not. My takeoff point will be for two of the quotations I read at the end of the last subunit, one from Franklin Tricchia, arguing that the task of a professor, right, is to help the student focus on particular horrors of his or her times, that is to say, to be critical of existing society, and that the job of the professor is not so much to focus on issues of truth, but rather to exercise power in order to bring about social change. Now, what are the horrors of the current time, or from what perspective do we see the current society as being horrible? And if we're interested rather in exercising power rather than truth, we're setting aside truth issues, we're focusing merely on power. Why are we setting aside power? How do we want to exercise power? And if we're talking about social change, what kind of social change do we want to bring out? What we have then is the professor as a kind of political activist in the classroom, and that's going to transform the nature of education, obviously. The other quotation I wanted to touch base with once again is the one from Jacques Derrida, arguing as a postmodernism, one of the things that motivated him to do all of the epistemological work and the linguistic work and the deconstructive methods that he applied to literary texts and so forth, his statement that that was of interest to him coming out of the tradition of Marxism, as he put it, in a certain spirit of Marxism. So what is this spirit of Marxism that is motivating Derrida, and in what way is it just going to be a spirit of Marxism, not necessarily the actual historical Marxism, or at least Marxism with some variations that the postmodernist educators are going to want to put in practice. So for that, I want to do a little thumbnail history of Marxism, because while postmodernism does have things to say about human nature and ethics and values and epistemology, and it's anti-metaphysical in some ways, the political theme, particularly the history of Marxist political thought in both theory and practice in the century leading up to postmodernism, is an important part of the story. So I have on the board here a timeline. If we go back to 1850, we'll start the story somewhere around there, and then we'll bring the story up to the early noughts here in the early part of the 21st century where we are now. Now, 1850, not too arbitrary. We can single out a date 2 years earlier, 1848. This is the year that Marx and Engels jointly publish the Communist Manifesto. And this then is, as a manifesto should be, kind of a rallying cry for certain segments of the left, particularly the far left, to mount a revolution, or work toward a revolution, right, in the name of a species of socialism, the communist species of socialism. Now, Marx also worked out any number of more economic treatises and political treatises, and did kind of quasi-sociological work, and was very engaged with ongoing current events and interpreting them in the light of his system and so forth. And in his position, writing primarily from England, being a transplanted German, England then being the heart of advanced industrial capitalism, Marx sees England as a laboratory in which history is being played out. And so he is in a position then as a social scientist and as a politically and economically engaged social scientist to make certain predictions about how capitalism is going to play out. Now, the argument that the Marxists then are making is that capitalism is, of course, an evil system. It's an exploitative system. It's a zero-sum system. But if you characterize the system that way, then there are certain predictions, right, that one can make about the logic of capitalism, how it is going to play out. And so farther over to the left here on the board, I have a miniaturized table. What we have then is the bourgeoisie in economic competition with the proletariat. That is to say, those who own property and those who work for those who have property. And in this case here, the bourgeoisie are going to be those who are rich, because they own all of the property, and the logic is that the proletariat are going to be the poorer members of the class. They have to sell their wages for subsistence labor. And then, of course, in capitalism, there is a nascent middle class that comes into existence, but Marxism has a logical prediction for how that is going to play out. Now, if we have then a rich class and a poor class engaged in zero-sum competition from each other, the Marxist analysis then argues that out of competition you have winners and you have losers. Those who lose in various forms of economic competition, they then get forced into the middle class. Those who win the economic competition, they then are in a position to become rich and powerful. And the Marxist argument is as successive rounds of competition carry on, what should happen is increasing numbers of people are forced into poverty, and then smaller numbers of people emerge in the zero-sum competition as being at the top of the heap and so forth. The rich and the poor are engaged in economic competition with each other, but also within the class of the bourgeoisie, those who own property, they are engaged in economic competition with each other. Some of those lose in the competition, they're forced down to the middle class or even into the class of the poor, and those who are more ruthlessly successful in that economic competition, they amass greater and greater amounts of economic wealth and power. And so what we should find then is a small group of very wealthy people at the top of the economic heap, and then a large group of very poor people at the bottom, right, of the economic heap, so to speak. Now, about the middle class from the Marxist perspective is an unstable class. It's brought about by capitalism. Capitalism does generate some goods, but what we have is, of course, the zero-sum competition applies to members of the middle class. Once one loses one's property and is forced into the poor class. Some small number of the middle class will succeed in clawing their way up into the rich class, but nonetheless what we should find then over time is the zero-sum competition forces people either up into the rich class or into the poor class, and so we should have a declining middle class. So what we then have is a Marxist analysis of capitalist society that leads to then three fairly definite predictions here, and these are the predictions that are worked out by the middle part of the 19th century in Marxism. So part of what the Marxists then are doing, as well as engaging in political activism and so forth, is waiting for the logic of capitalism inexorably to work its way out in this particular form. And then their hope is that once you have a very small number of people in the rich class and a large number of people in the poor class, these poor people have become increasingly desperate, they develop a class consciousness, they will rise up in revolution and overthrow the rich class. Now the problem was that by the time we go across a couple of generations here, it's getting now to the 1870s, the 1880s, the 1890s, and 1900s and so forth, it doesn't seem to be that the poor are becoming revolutionary. There are obviously there's historically some unrest here and there are clashes here and there, but we don't find the great class consciousness developing, and we don't find the mass revolutionary movements going on. And that is, of course, very unsettling from the classic Marxist perspective. But also, if we are attending to the numbers, we're crunching the numbers, we're generating the statistics and so forth, as we should be doing as good social scientists, by the time we get to the 1900s and on well into the 1900s, even with things like the First World War, the Great Depression, the recovery from the Great Depression, what we find, though, is that the actual results of the development of capitalism don't seem to be going in the direction that Marx predicted.